Hello, everybody. I was worried about tech, so I don't know if you heard my background. I've worked 38 years at the San Francisco Maritime Museum, and I formed this program because over almost 40 years I was there at so much of this, and archaeologists come and go. Different things have happened, but I was able to be friends and interested in all of them, and they shared their pictures and stories. And at the end, I sort of had this little legacy I had to share, an obligation. Anyway, without further ado, as the famous line says, during the gold rush, the Chilean journalist Benjamin McKenna wrote that San Francisco was a Venice built of pine instead of marble, a city of ships, piers, and tides. Large ships, a good distance from shore, served as residences, stores, and restaurants. The whole central part of the city swayed noticeably. Wrong button. Like many stories, this one begins with a map. The Maritime Museum created this buried ship map in 1963, informed by researching contemporary newspapers and photographs, and it was a lot of work for them. There are many versions of this map out there, but every one of them can be traced to this first original. There's a list of 56 ships at Rincon Point, down here in the lower foreground. On the left, there was Charles Hare's shipbreaking yard, right here, those red ships. When the newspaper said such and such a ship had gone to the point, to Hare's yard, the researchers would note that. 56 ships went there, but you can see there's only room for 4 or 5 red spots. Here you have Market Street. The ferry building is the red spot there. And Rincon Point. Okay, next. Okay. Archaeology has been described by some as the science of correcting the written record. It had been almost 60 years since the last map, and based on newspaper stories and accounts, since then, more ships had been discovered by building excavations, and a lot more research had taken place. Locations were sometimes inaccurate. So at the Maritime Museum, we corrected much and created a new map with the artists Michael Warner, Amy Hossa, and 3 archaeologists. It was recently featured by National Geographic on their website. You can see here the shoreline of the former Yerba Buena Cove and the Yerba Buena Mint, Clinopodium douglasii, which is very rare. It's a little bit out by the Palace of Fine Arts on the road there. Dolphins, the art pieces there are like the dolphins are typically used on ships to support a ship's compass. The tortoise, down here, lower left corner for those online. More on him later. We'll explore those ships and sites that have been unearthed up to today in chronological order. These are the red ships, and only these have seen the light of day. At the peak, there are hundreds of ships floating, or rather resting on their keels in the shallow harbor. It's estimated that nearly 100 of them were used as storeships. The cove was so shallow that long wharfs had to be built to reach the vessels. Then the city began to be built out from the shore and around the vessels, and the infamous fire of 1851 burned the ships down to the waterline. The sand hills were then used to fill in the cove. First was the Apollo. The ships beneath San Francisco's downtown have nearly all been located by building excavations. Apollo takes the cake for having been discovered 4 different times. In this, the famous Forest of Masts photo at UC Berkeley, we can just see Apollo roofed over. 2,000 of these buildings, that's 3/4 of the city at the time, were lost in this fire, May 4th, 1851. Light from this fire was reportedly seen from as far away as Monterey by sea. Apollo and other ships were burned to their waterlines and soon buried by the sand hills pushed over them to create valuable land. Here's a better view of the Apollo and her tall planked sides enclosing her deck. In the foreground is a steel building. Down here, It's built in the Quonset hut type style, imported to resist fire, but the fire melted the metal and the bricks were turned to rubble. You can see the sheet metal here. It went in being, it's halfway, they've only roofed half of that particular building at that point. And it's reassuring when a drawing matches the photograph. In 1849, Apollo arrived from New York with passengers and cargo financed by the New York Sun's publisher, Moses Beach. He sent his sons along to manage the ship. Attempts to get outgoing cargoes when they got to San Francisco to New York or Sacramento failed. His son, Henry Beach, roofed the Apollo over and rented her to store cargo, board sailors, serve as a restaurant, and he built a shed alongside to be a grocery and liquor store. Despite gold rush business booming for everyone else, Beach wrote to his father in New York that he had to keep lowering the rents. In numerous letters, he wrote frequently of the ship's increasing business troubles, and he blamed the poor water access. He wrote home in January 1850, noting that, "The way I worked and toiled on the Apollo property, I know it has shortened my life 5 years, and it has effectively cured me of speculation in this country." But see Apollo's grocery liquor store? Apollo's stern was up against what would become Battery Street. "Poor water access," wrote the son, and he wrote his father that he would probably have to sell the ship. It's things like these, when you read these letters and then see the images and begin to trust the images when they correlate, this is a whole story worth exploring. What's the truth with Henry Beach and his father in New York and this ship? Everyone around, other store ships were doing quite well. But there would be no sale for the Beach son. The worst of San Francisco's 7 fires within 2 years started around 11 p.m. on Monday the 3rd in a paint and upholstery store at Portsmouth Square, just a few hundred yards from here. And it burned all the next day. 50 years later, in 1901, and then 1907, 1921, and 1925, construction projects encountered different parts of the ship. The 1925 excavation for the Federal Bank exposed the Apollo sternpost seen here, and the rudder, and a few artifacts were found. The Federal Bank mounted a glass case filled with artifacts, mounted it atop the salvaged sternpost in their lobby. In 1980, when the bank relocated, the artifacts were donated to the Maritime Museum. Here's that same sternpost we've put on display in our lobby at the San Francisco Maritime Park Visitor Center. And it's a piece you can touch. And these are some of the artifacts that were displayed in the bank's case. An auger at the top left, a brass label for sardines, a ceramic pipe bowl with the word Glasgow readable on one side, a brass cup for a gold scale, parts of 2 ship sextants, and a copper drift. A drift is a spike for fastening big, heavy, large timbers. A few years later, a wonderful diary kept on board by one of the Beach brothers was donated to the Maritime Museum by a descendant. In it was a map detailing the 6 weeks it took Apollo to get around Cape Horn. From April 23rd to June 4th, which is the extent of this map, and which is winter there. 6 tortuous weeks around Tierra del Fuego. It must have been hell on board. Inside the journal was a wonderful detailed description later of sailing through the Golden Gate. Beach wrote that the sky was dark with birds and the sea alongside the ship filled with fish. So amazed was he that he even drew the fish that he saw in the diary. The Lydia. In the mid-70s, there began a mammoth project to build a sewer from North Point to Isles Creek. The trench fort exposed the remains of the whale ship Lydia on King Street, out near today's ballpark. Lydia would be the first of several ships to be dug up in close succession. Harlan Sutton, my boss, seen here, these 3 guys, Roger Olmsted from the Maritime Museum, and archaeologist Alan Pastrin are seen here alongside the Beltline out at King Street. As you can see, proper archaeology and a sewer trench was impossible, but some details were recorded. The San Francisco Chronicle wrote of Lydia's passing March 28th, 1907. And by the way, that brass plaque is out. You can see that on the out by the ballpark on King Street. The Chronicle wrote of Lydia's passing on March 28th, 1907. Quote, "The old whaling bark Lydia has finally disappeared from the face of the earth. She disappeared from the sea many years ago, and with stern embedded in the mud and bow high in the air has lain near the old Pacific mail dock, apparently impervious to wind and weather. Her stout oak frames, held together by copper spikes, have defied time and the elements, while other ships, built after she became old, have slipped into oblivion. But now the Lydia is no more. Men with heavy sledges yesterday completed her destruction, and after pounding on the old hulk for days, the Lydia was built in 1840, and under the command of our old-time Yankee skippers out of New Bedford, has pursued whales in every sea." And now Niantic. This, has anyone here not heard of Niantic? Oh boy, okay, that's great. And she's our most famous buried ship, I would say. Niantic, in 1872 and again in 1906, the Niantic's timbers were exposed when excavating for 2 successive hotels on top of the old ship. The ship provided her name to each of them. The first excavation in 1872 turned up 25 cases of champagne, and a tasting was arranged with much fanfare and high expectations. But the drink, quote, "had sediment and lacked the effervescence common to the drink." In 1980, amid the heaps of artifacts in the museum basement, I helped arrange a similar tasting for the television news. Judging from the taster's expressions, it was a whole lot worse than that. Now, Niantic is better seen here. I'll try and point out. This is her bow, and they curved. These are old sails with boards on top to keep it watertight. Keeping cargo dry, very important. The sign on top, and her stern was the Hotel Saloon. This is another building, and this is another roofed ship we'll get to later. She's the first recorded instance of a ship being hauled ashore and housed over to become not only a store ship, but also a saloon and a hotel. We can also see a white building, the Hoff store, which was the San Francisco Harbor Master's office. Archaeologic excavations there at the office found green olives in a jar, huge jars of green olives, 2 toy Chinese junks made for children, Chinese plates and imports, all wonderful evidence of the first West Coast trade with China. And this is Niantic as painted in China at Whampoa, upriver from Hong Kong. Her first career as a China trader was freighting to New York teacups, furniture, and other luxury dainty goods. It was basically furniture and teacups and porcelain to New York, and stoneware and rugged stuff, mining shovels and things to San Francisco. But the way this worked was the enterprising artist would prepare many of the background scenes ahead of time. And as a ship arrived in port, they would paint that particular ship on the pre-painted background, row out to the ship, and try to sell the painting to the captain. According to the Peabody Museum, you can recognize these China trade paintings by the craquelure, the very fine hairline cracks that are all over the painting. And the reason for that is the captain would have to roll the painting up, put it in his sea chest, and go, it'd be there for half a year or more before taking it out. Now on the back were Chinese characters, and I photoshopped the conservator's photo for contrast. That's why the yellow tint. I then took the photo to the agent, the De Young, and I emailed several museums in China to try and get this translated, which wasn't easy as it turned out because it was an ancient, old type of Chinese. And the surmise, the result of all this came down to several phrases. This ship exempt, avoid fees, tax, and not to be controlled by a government officer. Taken all together, it seems that the painting itself served as an exemption pass, proof that the ship had paid its cargo tax or harbor fees, like a little passport. Now, after leaving China, the ship's career changed to that of a whaler. Her captain, Henry Cleveland of Martha's Vineyard, whose descendant donated us that painting, got 2 seats on United Airlines, the person with it and the painting going over, stopped in Peru, where he learned of the gold rush in a letter he received from the ship's owner. The owner urged him to take advantage of the gold rush in any way that he could. Cleveland sold the ship's whaling gear first, ka-ching, but not the iron whale blubber tripods. He laid in a cargo of lumber and 150 mules and sailed for Panama up the coast. The 49ers who were crossing the isthmus would pay a lot to ride mules rather than walk across. So at Panama, he sold the mules for a great profit, ka-ching, and had the crew build passenger bunks from the lumber he'd brought. He then loaded in 249 passengers at $250 apiece for San Francisco, ka-ching. In San Francisco, he sold the lumber as there was none here, ka-ching again. Now, his son was aboard and kept a journal and even drew scenes here. You can see the passengers in the image on the left. These are the little boats coming out from Panama, filled with ticketed passengers to come aboard. And the title of the journal is "Ship." Above the picture is "Ship Niantic receiving her passengers at Panama." A journal kept by the son. The blubber tripods were used for cooking the passengers' food. I wonder how that tasted. The story of the disgruntled passenger is told by the son. Apparently, as they're rounding Cape Horn, just like the Apollo, with all the different wind changes and the struggle around, what happened was one of the passengers became utterly convinced that the captain was going in the complete opposite direction from San Francisco. What was actually happening, like most ships, they have to sail as much as 1,000 miles northwest, after rounding Tierra del Fuego in order to catch the right winds for San Francisco. It was during that 1,000-mile trek that this passenger just went crazy. And he actually challenged the captain to a duel. And this is the son writing this. His father, the captain, accepts the challenge on condition that he be allowed to choose the weapon. The passengers are a little scared they might lose their captain, and the event takes place on the main deck. And the captain goes back to the ship's stores and pulls out one of Niantic's old whaling harpoons. And shows up with the whaling harpoon. And needless to say, that the passenger backed down. Arriving in San Francisco, Captain Cleveland sold the ship to new owners. Ka-ching again. I mean, this guy really made the most. Niantic's just amazing how much advantage of the gold rush this captain was able to take. He sold the ship to new owners who at high tide work floated her to the shore with oil casks. See her at the pier with Apollo. Apollo is up there with the straight sides, further out the pier. Here. We saw her earlier, and there's Niantic pulled onto the shore. A group of Chilean owners would come to own and operate the first 3 store ships in San Francisco. But what did she look like ashore? In this very famous image, a New York illustrator imagined the Niantic as he heard it, a ship for a warehouse, surrounded by buildings, which had a hotel and a saloon built onto it. And there you have it, the Niantic Hotel, the ship. Another one nearby, because he'd heard there were other store ships. Maybe that was supposed to be Apollo, who knows? But it's completely incorrect. It never looked anything like that. And how do we know? Because this is an 1851 pencil sketch drawn on the site. It's in the collection at the Maritime Museum. And it gives a very accurate picture. You can see the auction shed where they would hold regular auctions of other ships' cargo. The ship acted largely as a warehouse, and on the stern is the hotel and saloon. The signs Niantic Storehouse and Rest for the Weary and Storage for Trunks. The Niantic Storehouse is up here and not legible, but we know from primary accounts what that other sign said over the large warehouse entrance. Rest for the Weary and Storage for Trunks. I was able to commission an authentic diorama based on that drawing, written eyewitness accounts, and 2 photographs. Captain Cleveland used the ship's windlass to pull her further ashore. The ship's masts and yards were driven in to hold her up, and she was roofed over. Her bilge pumps were removed and used to pump water from an artesian spring serendipitously found at her stern. Note the wharves surrounding the ship now. She's completely the piers are surrounding the ship, not going anywhere now. These were built like a lattice all over the cove as it was slowly filled in, and they're accurately detailed on the new map. From a written account, we even knew the price of a gallon of water, which sold at her stern, $2. The high price reflected the fact that the nearest spring was in the Presidio. Horses, I went too far. Horses helped pull in the hills of sand, but so did men in carts. Seen here is an auction. Also, the gold pans, pickaxes, and shovels for sale, for auction, Chinese pottery in the barrel, and linoleum. These are rolls of linoleum. And yes, they had linoleum in 1850. In November of 2018, a National Geographic crew stopped by the Maritime Museum to do some filming of my friend Jim Delgado and myself for their series Drain the Oceans. Episode 4 is called Buried Secrets of the Gold Rush. And the artifice of that show is they find a shipwreck, they scan the heck out of it with side scans, sonar, and get every detail, recreate it, the artists, and then they film water draining away from Titanic or all these various vessels, one after the other. And but in this case, there was no water. It was San Francisco's dirt that rolls up like a rug off from underground as if you were beneath with the ship underground, and all the dirt goes flying. You've got to see it to believe it. It's crazy. Computer graphics. Now, Niantic was discovered in 1978 while excavating for a new building. Surprise. And as was typical, the developers allowed no time for careful study. Watching from the sidelines was a very bitter Carl Cordham, director of the Maritime Museum. Quote, "It breaks my heart, but we've done our best. In 1849, there were 700 sailing ships in this harbor. This was one of them. Not the only one, but the one we know the most about. City guidelines and requirements were later improved, and Niantic was used as a primary reason. City planning, together with stronger California regulations, do a much better job with permit enforcement today." Only 1 week was available to the staff and volunteers of the museum. These are librarians and volunteers helping pick up what they could as the construction mayhem is going on all around them. The stern of the ship was exposed, but not the bow, which still lies under the next lot. Perhaps one day that'll get dug up. The project was rushed. Nighttime looters and bottle hunters jumped the fences and made off with a lot. Photos of these things are still posted on the web today, and the name board is said to have been seen in New Zealand. The stern and rudder we did get. You may have seen this in the Maritime Museum with its rudder hanging. It's currently the only part of a buried gold rush ship on display in San Francisco. The Oakland Museum borrowed it for their blockbuster sesquicentennial gold rush exhibit in 1999. He squeaked it in with less than a quarter of an inch. It was almost touching. You had to take the door threshold off, and it was a memorable day. Linoleum. I mentioned the linoleum. Scores of it rolls were found with Niantic. It was invented in England back in those days. Basically, it was simply burlap with white lead paint and stenciling put on it. Pretty darn useful stuff to have in muddy, muddy San Francisco. Here we have a beautiful paper holder, which springs open the beak, and an inkwell. It said, the lettering on it says, Her Majesty's Royal Letters Patented Elastic Diaphragm Inkstand. So you have a kind of a piece of rubber in there to deliver just the right amount of ink. And everything, many of the things found in Niantic fell into 2 camps, or 3, the champagne and drink, and all the things you need for a stationery store, and all the things you'd need to go mine gold. Hose and hand pickaxe like that. Also, Belgian pâté, which reflected the money that was in San Francisco that it could afford such luxury goods at that time. And Jim found a fragment of a label on the champagne still there, just a tiny, not much bigger than a stamp, but it had enough writing. And he traced that to Jacques Hasson champagne. And you can still buy this. It makes a great San Francisco meal, with the right ingredients. And it's a little dear, but not impossible. Now, the ship William Gray. You may recognize this scene as the fountain at Levi's Plaza. In February 1980, the remains of an unidentified ship's hull were discovered there during excavation for the plaza. The headline says, "Old ship sees daylight, but not for long." The photo caption says, "That's the hull. Look fast because they're covering it up." The ship William Gray today is located directly beneath this fountain outside of Levi's headquarters. It served as a foundation to the Griffing's Wharf of 1852, which was adjacent to Griffing's bonded warehouse. If you were here for Jim Shine's talk, you know if it's a bonded warehouse, you know that it's liquor. And there were many, many of them in San Francisco. And a line of ships was sunk here and filled with rock to make a pier. You can see this line of ships, or rather wharf, clearly on the map. Gerald Adams of the Chronicle wrote at the time, quote, "A dispute of archaeological proportions broke out today between maritime historians and developers over a threat to bury the most intact gold rush hull in these parts." That was Carl's quote. Plans were prepared for a depressed ramp walkway to view the ship below the surface, but rejected by the developer. Quote, "It's crazy, it's criminal," roared Carl Cordham. "This and future generations can see one of the ships that helped build us, this society, Levi's no less." One young man working for the National Park Service later wrote, "I was standing on the deck of the gold rush ship William Gray as we peeled back the mud to reveal its deck, the bulwarks, and the chain plates that once supported the masts, all preserved after more than a century of burial in what is now Levi's Plaza. To actually walk the decks of a long-buried ship, to smell the bitter ashes of the fire that razed the town to the ground on May 4th, to watch the tide wash around the pilings of a dock burned to the waterline and buried 2 stories beneath the sidewalks, to open casks of biscuits, crates of wine, and sacks of coffee sealed in the mud for nearly a century and a half. That has been magic, and it inspired me to study these lost ships and docks that lie beneath modern San Francisco and tell their story." That person was park ranger and my friend Jim Delgado, who as director of NOAA's Maritime Heritage recently led explorations of so many submerged vessels in our bay. He most recently led the team that confirmed the identity of the last slave ship in the Clotilda. You heard of that, and National Geographic recently did a whole issue on just that ship and the community around it. The news article notes here, the rock from the last wall of the Gold Rush warehouse has been saved for reuse in some form in the plaza's landscaping, which of course was done by Lawrence Halpern. I used to pick my wife up every day across the street, pretty much up a block at Sansom, and we would have our lunch in the little park across the way from here. And I've been back here and studied those granite pieces alluded to in this 1980 article. There they are, around the base of the fountain. You walk on them as stair steps, and they're all through the park on the other side of Battery Street. The Rome. The Rome was a 3-masted Russian-built ship. And I know you see the American flag and go, "Richard, come on." But that came later. In 1850, she arrived in San Francisco after 7 months sailing from New York. She carried a load of passengers headed for the gold fields, along with a cargo of dried apples, 100 dozen bottles of ale, 100 dozen bottles of brown stout, barrels of beans, salted pork, cement, 50 cots, and 200 boxes of window glass. Now, this is where the Rome is buried, currently, still, for a long time. And you can see in the white square the Muni Tunnel bore on the right. That is the inbound tunnel, outbound as well. Now, why this location? This is right under Justin Herman Plaza in the bleachers area, not out in the middle of the street, but more on the city side. Why this location? A man named Fred Lawson made a business out of scuttling abandoned gold rush hulks to help would-be landowners establish title to water lots by demonstrating an improvement. Lawson himself, speaking to the San Francisco Examiner 38 years later in 1890, told about the Rome. The ship Rome was a big Russian hulk that cost me about $1,000. She was sunk by me at the southwest corner of Market and East Street. That's the Embarcadero for us. Under where the Ensign Saloon was. Her bow touches the edge of Market Street. I sank her for Joseph Galloway, and I had to do it in a hurry. Galloway bought a block. One morning, he came running up to me and excitedly asked if I had a ship. I told him, yes, I have the Rome. He told me an injunction was to be served on him to prevent him from having any more piles driven. But if he could have the ship scuttled before 1 o'clock that day, he would be all right. So before 1 o'clock, my towboat took the Rome into where he wanted it, and down she went. I got $5,000 for that job. And what he didn't talk about was the other landowner in the primary accounts found who tried to prevent him from scuttling a ship. He shot at him, and the bullet passed cleanly through both of Lawson's cheeks. It didn't stop the ongoing scuttle, but it didn't stop his career. With the luck of that, wow! I mean, just incredible. So there, Rome sat, thanks to Lawson, for 142 years before being encountered by a massive drill, drilling a tunnel for Muni. On December 2nd, 1994, Bechtel's on-site tunnel engineer, a Russian immigrant, in the pressurized drill head, whose English was heavily flavored with the accent of his native tongue, radioed a message to the surface, which was dutifully recorded in the written radio log. Tell Greg we have sheep in the tunnel. Up to her neck in water and buried by the sandhills pushed over her, she'd escaped the 1851 fire. And so today, Muni passengers pass right through the oak hull of the Rome. And a few artifacts were retrieved. One of Rome's anchors was donated to the National Park Service and is seen here today in the San Francisco Maritime Visitor Center exhibit. The waterfront, sailors called it Frisco. We recreated some of the way the digs would look. The General Harrison. She began life sailing out of New York, running south to New Orleans with passengers and cargo, and returning to New York with Southern cotton. Later, she plied the Pacific trade. On one voyage, she stopped in Valparaiso, loaded up merchandise, and arrived here in February of 1850, the same month as the Rome. Just like Niantic, she too is dragged ashore, propped up, and turned into a store ship on the very same Clay Street wharf as Niantic. Now, the Clay Street wharf is a short half block, just a few hundred feet over. And this time, thanks to a greatly improved city planning process, which required proper archaeology and time to do it, we have at last the first, emphasis here, the first unrushed, carefully carried out archaeology dig, the General Harrison. Oh, perhaps you'd like to see where she is. Well, there you go. But there's Niantic, the back of Niantic. This is Clay Street that became the wharf that both ships were tied up to. And then Apollo was further out on, much further out on. But there's General Harrison right here. That's the best picture and the only photograph of her. Just like Niantic, she too is dragged ashore, propped up and turned into a store ship in the exact same manner as Niantic. This time, thanks to a great, did I already read that? Thanks to a greatly improved city planning process, which required proper archaeology and time to do it, we have the first unrushed dig, General Harrison. And this is Alan. archaeologist and friend Alan Pastrin, he and his company, Archaeotech, led dozens of archaeological digs around San Francisco. He was there for the Lydia, that's the one with the railroad car, the Niantic, and the Hoff store, the harbor master's place. It's his team which begins the careful archaeology required of the developer before putting it in a new building at Clay and Battery. It's just down the street from the Transamerica building and the Niantic. He called me to say he'd found another ship, and unlike the Niantic and the Lydia, this time there would be actual archaeology. I convinced him to fly in Jim Delgado from Vancouver, where Jim was a Maritime Museum director. Jim arrives, and in just a few days, 9/11 hits. I took this photo later that morning. The dig had been shut down for 2 to 3 days. And like Niantic, her bow also remains under the adjacent lot, waiting for a future date with archaeology. You can see in the picture on the right, the redwood piles for the wharf around the ship. And note the water here. Though few people know it, the bay tides still rise and fall beneath all of San Francisco's downtown, located within the bounds of Yerba Buena Cove. That's 5 blocks in from the shore, up to Montgomery Street, right here. The tides underground, twice a day. So seen here is the tidal zone, complete with clams. And I love the clams. I've got a whole bunch of those clams. We use those in the exhibit to do a sort of diorama on this. You can see the big white PVC pipe here, the picture on the right. This is to drain the water. Twice a day, the water, you can see it here, coming in, up from below the San Francisco Bay tides. It took me, due to complex issues between the developer and Archaeotech, it took me 14 years to get the artifacts from this dig into the National Park Service collection. Internally, I also needed to justify their significance. Jim Delgado furnished me with the authoritative words, "The General Harrison collection is the best studied, best documented, and most complete of any gold rush ship site. The quantity and quality of salvaged cargo represents the earliest evidence of economic ties between San Francisco and the global economy, only possible through storeships of this time period." And he had some nice pictures made. This is the ceiling planks. On a ship, the ceiling extends not just overhead, but under your feet, on top of the ribs. These. And a cross-section of the ship. First, bottom 2 levels used as the warehouse, and up above, another saloon. This is looking down the hull. I could not even fit my hand in between the oak 10 by 10s that you see there. That's really rare they're put together like that. And Steve Canwright, my colleague at San Francisco Maritime, wrote, "This is the best built major wooden vessel I've ever seen. To my rough West Coast eyes, the General Harrison is a marvel of craftsmanship. She reflects a period of Yankee skill and pride which can never be equaled. The quickly built clippers or the huge Down East cargo ships cannot compare for quality. She's framed up almost solid throughout her length." Found here also were the tools used by the Chinese shipbreakers from the Hare Yard, Charles Hare. These were, the Chinese laborers were brought in to salvage the metal. The metal spikes were brass and iron valuable also. And so the tools they used to hammer out these spikes and pull on them at the same time, very unusual tools. We got those, and they were just lying there in the hull, along with, not seen here in the picture, but there was 20, 30 different holes. Once they pulled the spike out, the water would come in. And this did not make for good conditions for their work. So they would hammer in a wooden spile, and so all those wooden spiles were there as well with the tools. It was just amazing. The fire came. Of course, they were working with the rest of the ship above them at that time. And cases of champagne and wine, typical San Francisco cargo, lots of it. Here's a blow-up of that picture. And notice all the little speckled beads in the background in the burn layer. There's hundreds and hundreds, millions of these decorative beads. There they are, cleaned up on the left. And Jim had me going there for a minute. These are beans, chili beans, and he said, that's how they got their name. The cargo came from Chile. They're chili beans, but I think he was pulling my leg on that. There's a ship's top, which is the section of wood used to join the main mast going up, and then the next mast, thinner, bolted to it. Not bolted, but held by this, which is upside down. Those big iron hoops are used to connect the shrouds for the sailors to climb up into the rigging. A piece of china, a pipe bowl, Turkish head on a pipe bowl. Turkish tobacco was regarded as the finest. You see that on the branding of Camel cigarettes and the artwork there still. And most amazing, to my way of thinking, was the amount of cloth that was found that buried in the mud and the water, and it cleaned up quite well. Wow. Isn't that beautiful? And now we come to not a ship, but a remnant of one of San Francisco's oldest wharfs, located at Thompson's Cove. The Cove was named for Alpheus B. Thompson, who operated a hide house there in the 1830s. So we're now talking 19 years before the gold rush. First evidence of the tallow trade in San Francisco was found here thanks to Alan Pastron and his team. But where is that? Thompson's Cove. Well, this is Captain Augustus Harrison's 1848 map of the city, and the location for this wharf was chosen because of the sheltered lee of the point, and that it was the deepest water in the cove, made possible by the shoreline bedrock here connecting to adjacent Telegraph Hill. The pre-Gold Rush wharf remnant, seen in the last slide, has been removed, and now you just see the large rock. This is the foot of Broadway, just a block in from the Embarcadero. The foot of Broadway, that must literally be the foot. It's a giant rock. This is Alan Pastron's crew near Broadway and Davis, a block in from the Embarcadero, near Telegraph Hill. It's the same bedrock as Telegraph Hill, but 15 feet down and worn by the 19th century waves. This wharf became the foot of the famous Broadway wharf where the clipper ships docked. In fact, this bedrock must literally be the foot. And found here was a barrel, 15 bottles of beer, and many cattle bones sawn and butchered. The archaeologist's report indicated that the butchered bones are evidence of the hide and tallow trade. During this period in the 30s and 40s, cattle were driven to the waterfront and slaughtered on the site next to the ship to reprovision them. This is the world of Richard Henry Dana in 2 years before the mast, when the Boston men sailed up and down the coast collecting the hides from all the missions and bringing in Boston goods and so on, collecting the hides to create, to supply the tanneries back east to make shoes. But even more incredible were found these Galapagos tortoise bones. The green sea turtle one is at the bottom, very distinguished from the land tortoise up above. Archaeologist Siler Conrad first identified and researched most of this story. The ships sailing north up the coast stopped at the Galapagos Islands to reprovision with water and meat for their crews. The tortoises and green turtles were abundant there and could live without water or food for months in the holds of the ships. Those not eaten at sea made it to San Francisco to become high-priced delicacies. In 1850, San Francisco ships took direct voyages to the Galapagos just to procure tortoises. They didn't just stay here, abandon crews, and sink and die here. They were trying to get cargoes up for Sacramento, going out and going as far as the Galapagos Islands in search of business and money to bring these tortoises back. They were sold on arrival in San Francisco. They took direct voyages there. In 1849, B.B. Redding witnessed the capture of 92 Galapagos tortoises weighing between 450 and 600 pounds. The live tortoises were sold on arrival for more than the value of the cargo of lumber aboard his vessel. At the top, that's how they would carry a turtle. At the top is an ad for the Venetian restaurant at Jackson between Kearny and Montgomery. We are between Kearny and Montgomery now, and Jackson's just a few blocks over. My phone's going off. Excuse me. At the lower right is the Florence Saloon at Montgomery and Commercial, right here. A couple 100 feet maybe outside the door and turn left was the Florence Saloon. The importation of tortoises continued for at least 5 years. The schooner Tarleton arrived in San Francisco on May 14th of 55 with 580 terrapin on board. Imagine that. In May, the Daily Alta California reported the departure of a schooner from San Francisco with 500 Galapagos tortoises bound upriver to Pleasant Ranch. What a name. 12 miles south of Sacramento. The paper quote was, "The animals seemed to enjoy themselves amazingly, though they'd eaten nothing since leaving the Galapagos Islands and were enjoying grazing there on the banks of the Sacramento." Imagine. Another close-up of the Galapagos bone there. Briefly uncovered by James Allens, the archaeologist, was part of the Arkansas in the fall of 2017. This photo is E. Clampus Vitus 8 years earlier celebrating their placement of a plaque commemorating Arkansas in the old ship saloon as the ancient watering hole that it was. But upon entering the bay in December of 1849, the Arkansas stranded aground on the shore of Alcatraz. On board were 76 Christian Methodists, the rest all gamblers and men with all manner of vices. Imagine that scene in the midst of a grounding. Finally towed ashore and dragged up Pacific Street, a gangplank was cut into the side of the ship with a sign reading, "Good, bad, and indifferent spirits sold here, 25 cents each." In 2017, at the bottom of a very narrow hull, a 12-foot-long false keel was spotted, and they didn't even remove it. A false keel is just a piece of wood you hammer onto the bottom of the keel of your ship to feed the torados so they don't actually eat your real keel of the ship. Hence the false keel. It's replaceable. Now, Rincon is Spanish for corner, and Rincon Point, appropriately, is where the waterfront takes a sharp turn south. Rincon Point, of course, is where the Bay Bridge footing is. Now, this scene of a Chinese shrimp camp is just a few hundred yards south of the Rincon Point Bay Bridge of today. Looking down the peninsula, Charles Hare's shipbreaking yard is behind us, around the corner. What the hell was that?
I don't know.
I turned the mic off.
It might have died.
I turned the mic off.
Here.
I thought it was the next earthquake.
We'll switch over to this one.
It's all good?
Yeah.
It's quite simple.
Lean back in there?
Yeah, it's all good.
Try.
You see 100 chairs falling over in the internet outline. Wow. We're all okay here, in case anyone out there is wondering. So yeah, this is looking south down the peninsula from basically the Bay Bridge, there where there was a Chinese shrimp camp. And Charles Hare's yard is behind us. It's an exquisite painting in the collection of the California Historical Society. Now, Charles Hare employed many Chinese workers from this shrimp camp. Who was Charles Hare? He was a shipbreaker, a dismantler of ships. You can see the red boundary line at the point here, the red dotted line. He ran a large yard between 1854 and 59, and more than 200 vessels disappeared beneath the sledges and axes at Charles Hare's yard. He employed over 100 Chinese, many of whom resided at the fishing village we just saw. I placed about where that is scale-wise by the red star up there, where that painting was. 3 archaeology digs incrementally encountered Hare's yard over 27 years. First, the Hills Plaza. The Hills Plaza dig was the first and revealed part of the shipbreaking yard. Years before the dig at the shrimp camp, denoted by the red star, a small ship timber was found at an unrelated archaeology dig. It was bristling with numerous yellow metal spikes and copper nails partly removed. It was thought to have been carried to the village, perhaps to be worked on as piecework, or possibly to train youth at the village for the work itself. What was found? Mostly just lots of big ship timbers. Good timber could be used in new ships. The rest was valuable as firewood. Some interesting pieces were found. These are drafting numbers on the vessel to show how deep in the water you are. A frame rather of a ship to give the ship shape, upside down in this to show you the 15 that was actually found. Piece of chain and a deadeye for tightening up the shrouds. The second dig, much later, in August of 2005, 17 years later, and the Candace is discovered in the Hare shipbreaking yard. There's a display on the Candace in the back of this room, right over there. More on that in a minute. In 2005, she's discovered that this is the site of today's Infinity condominiums. New residents there wanted to bronze it like a baby shoe when they heard of all the problems with conservation. Why don't we just bronze it? Their restaurant is right now still named the Candace. Like Niantic hotels, the ship gives the name to the surface development. The same archaeologist who worked on the Rome, the Arkansas, Dr. James Allen, was in charge of this dig. And carefully laid out were these salvaged timbers. More areas of the shipbreaking yard were slowly being revealed. This one we chose for display, and it's on display at the Maritime Museum, this center one here. And as more was revealed, came to the lattice platform. The surmise on this, pretty secure, is that the ships could be dragged on it and the men could stand on it. I mean, this mud was vicious. It would be up to your hips in this shoreline mud. It was one way to stay out of it. Two pieces were saved, this one being lifted on, and the stern. Now, you saw the picture of the Niantic stern and rudder in the lobby of the Maritime Museum earlier. If you were standing here at the base of the rudder, you would just come a little bit above halfway. It's twice as big, just huge, and it's been saved. The pieces were taken to Pier 50 for storage. The National Park Service turned it down for reasons of money. The Mint Museum, this same outfit, of 2005, agreed to take it, though it proved too much for them also in the end. Now you can see his back turned to the camera, the great-great-grandson of the Candace captain, he lives here in San Francisco, works on Broadway, Battery in Broadway. And he paid the port rent for it for over 2 years. The San Francisco port owns it now, and it's in a building. It's been moved out to Crane Cove Park at the foot of 18th Street by the water. There's a brand new little park there, beautiful park, check it out. And there's a big building. It's the one that says Crane Cove on it, and in there is the Candace. And the Mint is, with Lana and all, is trying, we are trying to inspire, let San Francisco know this is their opportunity to save the only piece, other than that little bit of Niantic in the Maritime Museum, a gorgeous big piece. And you know, what business can take this on? We tried a lot at the time, and we're ready to try again. Pieces were found with it, above it. A doll, they're not particularly related to the ship. The cloth could be cargo, the red cloth there. And there's a lot of smoking in those days, of course, a lot of pipes. But that beautiful Chinese plate is definitely imported. There were many of these imported to San Francisco, the stoneware. And that design is called the snail design in English, the Chinese plate. The unglazed portion was so that in China they would stack these up 25 high and put them in the kiln so that they didn't stick to each other. It was sort of mass production for that. One of my favorites, a stylish gold rush boot, work boot. And also found between the ribs, secreted there by a sailor, 2 sperm whale teeth that he never got to. These sperm whale teeth confirmed Jim Delgado's identification and the fact that the ship was a whaler. Let me see if I can make this little bit of tech work. Yeah. And then 8 years after the canvas, a third dig, a block away, discovered even more of Hare's Yard and one of our favorite finds of all, a cargo lighter at Folsom in Maine. You see it there. Dr. James Allen, again, serving as archaeologist. It's also on top of a spring, a water spring, which generated a whole bunch of other questions. This lighter was located on the border of James Houseman's shipbuilding yard and Charles Hare's shipbreaking yard. They shared a property line. No doubt that Hare supplied Houseman's shipyard with ship parts and ironwork from the ships he's taking apart. The freshwater spring, it's not clear what that is about yet. It was a most rare and unique find. But what, might you ask, is a lighter? Are we still stuck on that thing? Come on. Go away. It's a flat-bottomed workboat to get cargo ashore, as you can see. And the art of the day, we've seen Apollo before. There's 2 or 3 lighters there taking cargo away. In the painting, the famous hanging on Commercial Street, there's 2 men standing in a lighter. There are many lighters in this old lithograph coming ashore. These were extremely common and absolutely necessary in a cove so shallow. Even the photographs picked up, there's 3 lighters in this picture in the foreground. And Rincon Point, across the way in the upper right-hand corner, just a little tiny piece of land there in the upper right, that's Rincon Point, where Charles Hare is at the foot of, taking the ships apart. And this is Charles Hare's front yard and his building in the foreground, along with what was at the time basically a rotter's row. As the ships became you couldn't rely on them floating too much, or they're so wrecked they're never going to sail again. They would be shunted down to with the wind at their back towards Charles Hare's yard. You can see a ship's mast in the water. If you really look, right there. That's the top that the sailors would stand on normally. And this is the Kangaroo. You can actually read the name right there. Not in this particular slide, but in the actual photograph. And blowing that up, I believe this is not a store ship per se. Instead, I believe this is most likely a dormitory for the shipbreakers or the shipbuilders. The reason being, it's one of the only ships with a roof that's peaked like that, sharp and pointed, for ventilation and comfort for people inside. Also, in a store ship, you never saw windows up and down for light and air. And furthermore, a window is a risk to cargo that must be absolutely dry. And this, just maybe, hopefully, could be the actual lighter that was found, because it's almost in the exact same location. Here is a lighter, perhaps that lighter. I want to believe it's that lighter. The curious thing is it's attached to a deck. Right here in the foreground is the deck. And on the deck, lots of iron hoops, rings, bolts, barrel hoops, all kinds of salvaged metal. And one surmises possibly that set on top of the spring, that the lighter was used as a sort of dipping tank to get the mud off everything and muck and throw it onto the deck. It was physically attached, the deck, to this lighter. And nearby, other salvaged parts, that's called a breast hook, goes in and that's the curved piece here. A rare and highly sought after type of wood in boat building. And this is really nice archaeology. one scrape at a time with the bricklaying trowel, revealing it carefully. And another top, like we saw earlier, to bind the top mast to the lower mast. And ship's knees, this is where a ship's knees, the wood here, is where the tree meets the ground and the root goes out. The grain all follows that curve. And very strong, as strong as possible, and very needed in ships. And you have the fire bucket boards for holding the fire buckets on board the ship, so they didn't go flying all over the place, with their sharp edges, and a privy seat with soft edges for obvious reasons. Oh, I missed one thing there. The Native American mortar stone, over here, was found there at Rincon Point, right where the Bay Bridge lands, proving that this was earlier a desirable spot for the Ohlone. And Tishman Speyer, the building contractor that built a lot of those high-rises down there at the foot of Folsom, paid to lift it out and built the whole thing at no cost and trucked it over to the National Park Service site in San Leandro for storage. Where we, the conservators took samples, mailed it to the forestry labs, and discovered that the wood was from Chile. It's a Chilean beech tree, and got the exact species name, which I don't dare pronounce. Anyway, that's Elizabeth Warren peeking through, applying PEG, propylene, ethylene, polyethylene glycol. And that is basically a watery wax used on all the Vasa, all kinds of underwater ships that are brought up, which would just curl up into a potato chip. If you didn't first, the wood cells would collapse once the water leaves. So you fill them with this wax that penetrates, takes years to go in. And it's been done, and here's how it looks now in storage, waiting for some future display of some kind. Well, there you have it, a tour of the ships of the Cove and one out by the ballpark, plus a Gold Rush wharf at Telegraph Hill, which have seen the light of day. There are many more, over 40 that lie beneath San Francisco, their hulls still bathed twice a day by the saltwater tides. What else are we going to find over the years? Right? Thank you very much.
Let me ask the first question with you.
Okay.
How do you propel a lighter? Doesn't have a mast, doesn't have, I didn't see any oars.
In one of those paintings, there's a pole is typical. Poling with a long pole.
Mud.
Yeah. I'm sure they used whatever was available, including old oars, but basically a pole. Yeah.
All right. I've got questions for this side. Do you have questions for that side?
They like the mic because of the online streaming. It goes out better.
Yes.
I think we turned the other one off. I can just yell it out. Just yell it out.
Okay.
When they find artifacts, when artifacts are found in a private building site.
In a private.
To whom do the artifacts belong? Want me to do that again? When artifacts are found at a private building site.
Yeah.
To whom do the artifacts belong?
To the developer. They belong to the private developer, the person that's bought the lot and doing it. However, there's a caveat with that they are required to provide for their preservation, and they don't like to do that because that costs money. And so what's really nice is that they tend to offer them to nonprofits, museums, and so on. So some of it comes that way. Unfortunately, the some of the very nicest stuff I'm not even aware, I don't even want to know, but they are allowed to, the developer, the head of the whole thing, whoever has the rights, could actually pick up a beautiful artifact and take it home and put it in his living room. No problem with that. I believe, I could stand corrected on that, but I'm pretty sure the artifact, we learned that at the General Harrison, belonged to the restaurant that was being developed there. But they, and there were 2 items they wanted to keep. And so we paid big money to have them replicated. So we had we were loaned the actual artifact, and we built a Graydon Wallach, amazing artisan. He replicated it. He worked for the museum, and he replicated those things. You could hardly tell them apart, the real piece. That's where we learned that they own them. Yeah.
Question?
Yeah. Anybody?
Anyway,
I've gone on so
Yeah,
long,
there.
they've got every answer.
on the side, you think?
With regard to the General Harrison,
Yeah.
there are nails, copper nails that are embedded in the sidewalk around the building itself. Were those, I heard those were found in kegs in the excavation. Is that true?
It's quite possible. I didn't know that. You're speaking of that restaurant cafe that has the sidewalk brass, and John, he wanted to say something else.
Oh, yeah.
On the corner there,
Yeah.
in the sidewalk, there are hundreds, thousands of little copper nails embedded in the
No
sidewalk.
kidding. I've walked that. All I've seen is the brass lines. I'll have to find that.
Yes, it's purported to be nails from the General Harrison,
Okay.
and there's an outline of the General Harrison there on battery and clay.
Uh-huh.
And if you come to the Sunken Ships Tour on February 19th at 11 o'clock, starting here at 608 Commercial, you're going to see it.
Fantastic.
I like that plug. You have any questions? Other questions?
There was a picture with hundreds of masks all together, a black and white photo. Can you describe the condition of those boats at that time? Were they still sailing? Were they going to the breakup? Or where were they going?
Well, yeah, most of the ships in that you see there are very old. Ships that were near the end could make one last voyage, bringing prospectors, gold, argonauts to San Francisco. They tended to be on their last legs as a group, categorically speaking, near the end. But, as I said in the program, those that were in better shape were able to go on and go down to the, Galapagos Islands and bring back tortoises. But it was very hard to find any work because there were so many ships, you competing for whatever was available. But
As you say, not a lot of parking places?
yeah, a lot got away. A lot did get away. When you see, as many as 600-700 ships there, they didn't all just plunk down into the mud. There's only 40 or 50, 40 to 50 under the city at this time. Yeah.
You have a question over here? Yeah.
Oh, well done. Lana's saying, one sec, that there was, the current issue of Panorama has a whole article here on the Candace inside, right? Have I got that right?
Finding a home for Candace.
Finding a home for Candace. We've got to find a home for Candace. If they can find a home for that Art Deco hot dog stand, 15, 20 feet on it, that heavy thing, I mean, we can find a home for this. It'd be fantastic. There was a question over there, I think.
Yes, how safe it is to have all those skyrock buildings like the Millennium and Salesforce in the area of the buried ship?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? And it's hard for me to hear that.
Sorry.
It's not just you, it's my hearing aid.
How safe it is to have all those high-rise buildings like the Salesforce and the Millennium in the area of the buried ships? How safe it is?
How safe?
Above those sites.
Yeah.
Oh, well, the 2 buildings you mentioned are not above ships. To my knowledge, they didn't have to do archaeology there, or they would have had to do archaeology to prove there was nothing. But as I know engineer, I don't know, they're pretty high, they're kind of scary to me underneath, but as far as the archaeology goes, That's safe.
Okay. But there were other space where there was a ship and they were building, the one that you showed to us earlier.
The tunnel, maybe?
Yeah, the one that you showed to us earlier.
Oh, that,
When they discovered the ship, when they were doing digging,
right.
is how safe it is?
Well, the process of digging is very, very dangerous itself. But basically a huge drill, 15, 20 feet, I don't know, 12, 15 feet in diameter is big enough for a Muni train to drive through, goes ahead. Attached to it, part of it is a giant pressurized, air pressure is higher. So the men go in there to manage this drill. They have to go through an airlock, just like a spaceship. They have to close one door, go into the next, and go into a much higher pressure, which keeps the water out. And then this thing is spinning slowly, cutting through the earth until it hits solid oak of a ship. And that was the Rome. And it hits that, and it starts grinding its way through. And that was difficult. Slowed things down a lot. But once it makes it through, they then line it with steel and cement, and that is very safe and very.
And they're going to bedrock too.
I gather they can go through that too. Yeah.
Thank you.
And there was a question here.
Back to racing.
Oh, Melissa, who helped Jim Delgado in Chile, I believe, right? With the General Harrison research, she was down in Chile. Go on. Sorry.
My question, you told a story about a man who paid $1,000 for a ship. And then he sold the ship for $5,000 to the developer?
Almost have it right. He bought the ship as a tool to use in his business of helping other wealthy men create ownership of land. So he had the Rome as in his back pocket, so to speak, as a tool, and he had to pay $1,000 for that coal hulk. Is all it was a coal hulk. And another man pays him $5,000 to sink anything, and he happened to have the Rome. So the other man pays him $5,000 to sink it right on his plot of land, so he can claim that piece of land for his own.
Okay, that's my question.
Yeah.
Why would you pay $5,000, which in that day's money, what is it? It's probably like, I don't know,
$250,000 or more,
I don't know.
half a million.
Why would you pay that much money to sink something?
Oh, well,
I
just,
mean, you're making it.
you're asking a really good question.
Yeah.
I don't know why the laws were written, and if you you could claim land as yours if your property happened to land there. It didn't belong to anyone at first, see, but you could claim it, establish a deed and claim to the land under it because there it was and it can't be moved now, so it's yours.
So that was in the same period as the water lots?
Water
down
lots.
there?
Yeah, same period.
Right.
Yep.
So land was precious, but if you could get some of that land and you could sink something, and now you own a piece of that water lot. And so there's some maps of just amazing amount of water lots, and that was the way. Because it's very hard to work the sandy hills of San Francisco or the rock hills of San Francisco. So creating something out there had huge value.
I'm happy to keep. I just want to work it in case people are leaving early. There, this map. We printed 500. The Maritime Museum bought several hundred of them, and we're trying to recoup our personal investment in these maps. They're for the low price of $10 each, and they'll be rubber banded and put at your disposal. If you didn't bring money, I'm happy to let you take the map, and you can PayPal me my email address, which is at the table there. That's how desperate we are to move these maps. So anyway, go ahead.
So the question is, we're talking about ships that have been discovered and have been documented.
Yeah.
Through all the years that you've been exposed to this information, have you ever through the research, have come across a ship that has not been dug up, but you feel that might actually have some value? I mean, where you might be reading through the research you said, well, if this thing is still there, there might be X amount of crates of this or that, where you think could be a promising,
Yeah, you're speaking of the value of treasure, of that basic search for treasure, finding something really valuable, and could we identify one of these golden ships that might have, because of its history, something valuable on board? From what's been found, even at General Harrison, I mean, you've got the beads, the champagne. There's some value in some of these things to collectors, but the real value is the knowledge and story of how San Francisco worked, how its global connections transformed the city into one in wealth and all that. And that's the stories. It's the stories of these various ships that basically give us that information. It's funny because only 150 years ago, but much of that was never really written down. It's just in old business records and the archaeology writing the story, basically.
in particular that you wish you could find more information on?
One doesn't come to mind. There's just so many.
Let me ask you a question.
Jim, one sec. Jim Delgado does think that it'll be very rare, if anything, as interesting and valuable as the General Harrison is ever found. Why? Because it's the biggest. There's nothing quite as big as that, quite as well built, with so much found with it. He did his PhD thesis on it, so he might be a little biased, but are you listening, Jim? Anyway, but he has said that to me, that he believes that's been the best opportunity for, and that nothing else will be, but he could be wrong. It could be something else, yeah.
Quick question. Is there any other place in the world that has a history like this that can be extracted on that time period? Obviously it's the 1850s or 1840s, but is there something out of Boston? Is there something out of the East River in New York?
There's things like it, like the Clotilda, which has been found, the slave ship down there, and it's again, there's nothing valuable with the ship, but the people that live literally within a few miles of it are descendants of the actual slaves that came on that ship. And finding that ship and identifying it the stories have led to buying the stories of all these people, getting them into National Geographic and so on. And they've become a community. They're meeting. They're meeting every month just to get to know each other.
Are telling us the story of what went on, not the value of the actual ship per se.
Yeah, and there was a ship in my research I saw, and I think it's pretty recent, in Boston. There has been a ship found that was burned and buried, and so there's one there. But I think of the Clotilda as a great example of just a bunch of muddy timber, but it defines the actual dimensions of a slave hold and has iron in it that was used to hold the humans in place on that voyage.
Last question here,
Fantastic.
and then we will dismiss. And if you want to ask Richard a question, then you can ask personally.
Thank you. As I recall, in like the mid-1960s, when they were doing the Golden Gateway here, they did come upon a ship buried, and I believe Leo McCarthy was a supervisor then, and was able to strike a deal with, I could be wrong, but I think it was Rockefeller organization that was financing all of this.
And where was this? There was a ship found?
It's right where the park is.
Golden Gateway.
That by the old El Fornillo restaurant there.
Well, right there at El Fornillo, basically its front windows look at that fountain, under which is the Lydia and the string of 6 ships. That granite wharf is right there. Must have been that.
Yeah, must have been, I suppose.
Right.
Well, thank you. We hope to see you next week.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. What's that?
take more questions.
Oh, yeah.
The crowd's gonna be.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, this is yours, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, good job. Thank you. Thank you.
We did get a couple questions online.
Oh, you did?
We could probably still answer them.
Oh, are we still on?
Yeah, we could use this microphone then.
Oh, okay.
The first question was, are there any glass bottom floors in SF where you can see an underground buried ship in situ?
The short answer is no, but we did do a glass floor and put rolls of linoleum and all kinds of artifacts underneath a glass floor that you can walk on. Where's the mic?
Microphone's right
Oh, right here. I'm sorry.
Okay, so the next question is...
And that's in the San Francisco Maritime Museum Visitor Center, the glass floor, recreating a dig, yeah.
Next question was, have any pre-Gold Rush Spanish period ships been found in the Yerba Buena Cove?
Pre-Spanish? Was it?
Pre-Gold Rush Spanish period ships.
No, sorry. No.
Okay. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us on the stream.
Yeah. Thanks for watching, everyone.